Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. Thanks, Kath. Welcome, everyone. Tonight's presentation is going to be as basic as I can make it. It's to do with Australian sheep breeding values and how to use them, particularly by identifying your production objectives and sourcing the traits or the figures, the values for those traits as closely as possible to help you meet your production objectives. At the end of the presentation, I'll walk you through a calculator that Murray Long and I have put together, which hopefully will one day be updated to an app, which helps you identify which animals are the best to buy in terms of genetics. But one thing to remember is that these ASBVs are a tool, and treat them as a tool. They're a part of your selection criteria. They're not the be-all and end-all. So what are Australian sheep breeding values? An animal's appearance or performance is a combination of both its genes and the environment in which it's raised. ASBVs are generated from pedigree and performance data, with raw measurements adjusted for differences in environment and management. Environmental things include things like age or birth date, the type of birth, was it born as a single or a twin or a triplet, the age of the dam, sex of the animal, and the rearing type. Your aim is, or the aim overall, is to determine how progeny would have performed if they've all been born as singles on the same day and raised in exactly the same way. So Sheep Genetics Australia, that controls the databases for Land Plan, Merino Select and the Duddy databases, for example, they're trying to take out all of the background environmental influence. How do they calculate them? They use information from the lamb itself, its siblings, linkages and information from both the dam and the sire. They use raw data. They use genomics and DNA testing and the like, and environmental sort of information in terms of feed and the like, and how they were reared. So what influences that animal's performance? We've gone through most of them, but feed is still a critical one. You can have the best genetics in the world, but if you don't feed, you won't get the response. The age of the animal, whether it was born as a single or twin, the dam's age. Now that's important because, say, a maiden ewe who's never been through lambing or lactation, hasn't had the udder development, hasn't got the maternal drive or maternal instincts of older ewes. So all this information is put into the database. So lambs that are born to maiden ewes, if you like, are given a little bit of leeway. And again, try to be compared on a common base, common ground. Any disease or parasite influence, and the genes, the genetics, the things we can't see. I took this photo in a workshop we did at Orange with Murray Long. Our industry is pushing for big is best. They're starting to pull it back now. There's some issues with selecting, for example, for very high growth rates and putting too much emphasis on that, in that we make a heavier, mature animal. If you went to a sale, which of those two rams are you more likely to buy? And 9 times out of 10, it'll be the bloke at the back. Now, these figures are from 2015, so 6 years ago. But those two rams, the one at the back was a single, reared as a single, and this little bloke at the front was born and reared as a triplet. So from day dot, or even before, well, in utero, he was behind the 8 ball. But if we look at their actual genetics, they're pretty well peas in a pod. So if you're privy to that information and you understand how to use it, you may well pick up this ram for $500 less, simply because he's a smaller stature. But genetically, his progeny will perform the same way as that other single-born lamb. So what are our primary profit drivers? This is important because I'm using 2 or 3 of these in the calculator that we'll talk about. Wool price is obviously a primary profit driver. Wool cut, sheep meat prices, weaning percent's a big one. kilograms of product produced, and your cost of production. Some of those you haven't got a lot of control over. The big driver in recent years, and we'll say the last 10 years at least, are sheep meat prices. And that's not just the slaughter lambs value, but it's sale of excess ewes, breeding ewes, if you're a self-replacing system. It's the mutton value. So it's all combined, the sheep meat price income. These are some gross margin results that I've been doing since 2007. The latest was in April this year. And what it shows is a breakdown of these enterprises in terms of percentage coming from sheep meat sales versus the percentage from wool or other products. If we look at the top one, that's a second cross lamb operation. At the moment, 98% of income is coming from the sheep meat side, right? As you understand, wool values for the first cross ewe are fairly low, and skin values have had a bit of a jump up in the last couple of weeks, but they're nowhere near what they used to be. If we look at the terminal merino, which is the pink line, and the green line, which is a doonie, they're pretty well all the way been sitting around the same. So at the moment, the terminal, like a white Suffolk over a merino operation, 75% of the income's coming from the sheep meat side, pretty much the same for the doonies. And this is the one that really, I think industry need to really sort of take more heed of. This is a self-replacing merino operation. I usually work on about 18.5 micron. Most of the costings are done around about 1250, 1300 cents clean. At the moment, that self-replacing merino operation, almost 70% of your income is coming from sale of meat. So on a breeding objective basis, that's something, and we're seeing more and more of it, certainly with what I'm reading with the merino ram sales that have been happening across Australia, that there are more and more people that are using ASBVs and selecting on carcass traits, things like growth rate, eye muscle and fat, to make our merino more of a dual purpose style merino. So what's the role of ASBVs? If we look at just say selecting on those carcass traits that I just mentioned, they can help increase birth weight, improve lamb survival and growth rates, reduce your turn-off time for your sale stock, have your ewe progeny reach mature weights earlier. So that's pretty important in a self-replacing system, particularly if you're interested in joining ewe lambs. Help to increase your joining and conception rates, improve dressing percentages, improve feed conversion, and help to produce more resilient breeding ewes and progeny. And the further we go down the line with climate change, whether you're a skeptic or not, heat does have a big impact on fertility in particular, but it's also going to impact on things like intakes and feed quality. So we have the tools through these ASBVs to help to try and produce a more resilient animal that's going to perform under harsher conditions. To maximise the benefits when you're using ASBVs, you must have a clear, measurable breeding objective. Now, the Bred Well, Fed Well programs, there's been funding for another round, so that program will go for another 4 to 5 years. It has in that workshop, it's a one-day workshop at the moment, it has in that workshop the best producer-based practical that I've ever been involved with, where it really, you can sit down, we'll work through it, and at the end of it, you can walk away based on what your emphasis is for most of the traits that you're selecting for, or your breeding objective is, and it'll tell you what values you should be looking at in terms of the ASBV traits. You should really know your primary profit drivers, most of which we've just gone through. You've got to place emphasis on those traits that are important to your breeding and production objectives, your targeted markets, and the environment that you're running the animals in. The targeted markets, and I would say most producers are pretty flexible now when it comes to selling time, particularly for the slaughter lambs. And I mean, the last 3 to 5 years, selling the store lamb, to my mind, has probably been a better option because there is such an interest in finishing lambs. there are now specific auctions plus feeder lamb sales, which have return buyers coming back. If you can show that your sires in particular have been selected for things like growth rate and fat and eye muscle, and there are flow-on effects there for some other traits. If you can show that, plus you can also show that you've imprinted your stock to recognise grain, for example, prior to selling them, there's a big marketing advantage there, and you will get return buyers. As I mentioned before, select replacement sires on both structural and genetic merit. Okay, they have to be able to walk, they have to be able to work, they have to suit, if you're a wool-based operation, the style of wool that you're after. So what are the ASBVs? The traits are expressed as an abbreviation of the trait name. So if you see WT, that means weight. If you see EMD, eye muscle depth. CFW, clean fleece weight, and so on. The trait ASBVs are all based around 0. I'll take you through a percentile table to show you this in a couple of minutes. But this baseline represents the average of traits back in 1990 for all the terminal sires and the year 2000 for the Merino and Duddy databases. So if we see a 0 on any of these figures, any of these ASBVs, these traits, that basically means that animal, if it's a terminal sire, is the same as it was back in 1990, 30 years ago, and likewise back in the year 2000. So the databases have been around for a while. Progeny testing and the like and performance recording systems, particularly in the terminal side, have been around for about 40 years. So there's a lot of background info going into these databases. Your sheep breeding values are expressed as either positive or negative deviations from an average. Negative ASBVs are not always bad. For example, the more negative a WEC or worm egg count, the greater the resistance the progeny of that sire have to a worm burden. Another example of a negative ASBV might be fibre diameter. So if you can look at the raw measurement of the animal on the sale catalogue, and then see where that fits or whether ASBV for fibre diameter is, it'll tell you whether or not you're likely to maintain or slightly improve on fibre diameter, or indeed even go stronger. So what traits are available? I've broken these both into carcass and reproduction and fleece and health traits, and these are not the total traits. This is the majority of ones that we generally sort of work on and use. So we have like birth weight, we have some growth rate, we have mature ewe weights, fat, eye muscle, lean meat yield, intramuscular fat. IMF in particular is very important in terms of eating quality, which is really gaining momentum. Dressing percent, shear force 5, which again relates to eating quality. We have our fleece characters like fleece weight, fibre diameter, CV, staple length and the like. So there's a lot of traits that you can actually select on. It's important, and it's something that we do take you through, say with that practical from Bredwell Fedwell, not to try and select on too many traits because your progress will be slow, right? 3 maximum, probably maybe 4 traits for whether you're a terminal or a shedder, a Duddy or a merino operation are probably ideal. The ASBVs have age-based prefixes. So if it's a B in front of the WT, that's birth weight. W means weaning, which is somewhere around 6 to 16 weeks of age. Post-weaning, 7 to 10 months of age. Yearling, hogget, adult, and so on. So again, P fat means post-weaning fat depth. So the fat depth at 7 to 10 months of age. Y CFW, yearling clean fleece weight. So that's clean fleece weight as a percentage, not as an actual kilogram value, but as a percentage as a yearling, and so on. Now, there's going to be a fair bit of information on these percentile tables. You can download all these from Sheep Genetics Australia website. And I would really recommend that you go armed with these if you're going to a sale. A lot of times the studs that are involved with Sheep Genetics Australia for Lamb Plan, Merino Select and that sort of thing will actually provide this information in the catalogue. And I guess I should prefix by saying that there's an estimate of something like 90% of all merino ram sales, semen sales in Australia are from studs that use ASBVs. And the old figure used to be about 70% of terminal size sold in Australia use ASBVs. On the Dorper side or the Shedder side, it was sitting around 35–40% of all size in Australia. There weren't a lot of studs, but they tended to be the larger studs. So it's there's a fair few out there, and you can certainly go and shop around if you need to. So the percentile bands show the range of ASBVs across all animals in that current year drop. We'll be looking at the 2019 and 2020 in a minute. It allows you to see where an animal's values rank for that trait within the breed or the analysis group. For example, if an animal's trait ASBV value is in the first percentile, it is one of the highest performing animals for that trait in the database. If it's in the 50th percentile, it's about average or median for that trait in that database. Now, all merinos are in the one database, so we have anything from the ultra fines right through to the broader type merinos, all in the one database. Our terminal size generally will be the Poll Dorsets, White Suffolks and the like. You also have maternal sire and the Doonies and the like. So this is a percentile band table. This is a slightly older one. It doesn't really matter. They don't change a great deal, but I just want to show you or walk you through. So we're looking here on a merino database. These are the traits that are listed. So yearling fibre diameter, yearling staple length, post-weaning weight, yearling weight, and so on. This band down this side indicates where the individual traits or rankings fall in relation to all the merino size tested in Australia. This 50 percentile value range here, again, is the median value of merino traits tested in Australia. It's pretty much an average value. We call it average. As I mentioned before, 0 is the average of all traits in the database back to year 2000. This is where they currently sit. So that's the average merino sire in Australia. They're pretty well all below that, as expected, because of the progress that we actually make. Indexes, I'm going to talk a little bit about index, but I'm not a big user of them. This one here, we've got dual purpose, Merino Plus and Fibre Plus. The index actually combines ASBVs for several traits into one value. So it tries to give you a value as a percentage value that you can sort of look at and say, oh, okay, that suits me. He's high up on that percentile, sorry, that index value. But they're available to suit a range of different breeding programs. They're a quick selection guide to narrow down size you want to look at. But please, while they're useful, it's important that you always consider the individual ASBV for the traits that you're looking at. Okay, and I'll show you why now. Again, we've got merinos here. We're going to have 2 rams. They're on the DP Plus index of 141. So that is down here. So that's in the 70 percentile band. Okay. These are the values of these 2 rams that go in to make up this index, and they put different weighting on on these traits. So some, and mostly growth rate has got a fairly heavy weighting in most of the indexes. Something like Fibre Plus is going to have more of an emphasis put on, say, clean fleece weight. So just bear with me. We'll just show you these 2 rams and we'll just see where we sit. There's our 50 percentile or average of rams in the database. Our first ram is around about in the top 35% for fibre diameter. So he's going to throw progeny. They're going to be a little bit on the finer side. He's slightly below average when it comes to clean fleece weight. He's up here in the 35–40 percentile for yearling weight or growth rate, about average for fat and about average for eye muscle. Our second ram, he's probably going to tend to be a little bit broader compared to this one, the green one. He's a cracker when it comes to clean fleece weight. He's in the top 15 or 20% of rams in the database for growing wool. Very similar in growth, a little bit better in fat, but not as good in eye muscle as our green ram. So they're basically two different rams. If you want to focus on rams that are going to throw or cut you more wool, this red one might be the way to go. Okay. I just want to walk you through a terminal one as well. In the terminal side, obviously, you don't have the fleece characteristics and the like to select from. Same sort of thing. We have the terminal database. We're looking at two rams, and these are real rams. These are ones I've pulled out of catalogues. There's Terminal Carcass Plus Index, TCP. These two rams both have a value of 146, which means by the index, they're in the top 20% of rams based on the weighting of all these traits that go into making that index in Australia. This is the Terminal Carcass Plus Index. You'll see that a lot of the emphasis is on post-weaning weight, a lot of emphasis on eye muscle, and a lot of emphasis on shear force, which relates to eating quality. Okay, so there's our 50 percentile. What are our two rams doing? This ram here, this is birth weight, 0.6. That basically says that compared to 1990, when the terminal started, this sire is going to throw progeny that is 600 grams heavier at birth. All right, now we have to take into account that he only gives half the genetics, but we do talk about heavier birth weights, better lamb survival, but there are restrictions. If I was using or looking to buy that sire, I would not put him over a Merino. I certainly would not put him over a maiden crossbred ewe. Big frame, older ewes, yeah, he may be okay because he's going to throw heavy lambs. Compared to this other ram, and his lambs are going to be slightly lighter, only 250 grams heavier than the average ram back in 1990. This red ram is an absolute cracker. He's in the top 1% for growth rate up to weaning. So an absolute cracker. If you want a fast growing lamb, he's probably one to look at. Our green bloke is sitting above average. He's in the top 35–40%. He's not too bad. The fat, however, of our red ram is right down here. He's in the bottom 5% in Australia. So he's going to throw progeny that are ultra lean, whereas this one's going to put progeny that are going to have a little bit more fat, which helps with things like eating quality and dressing percent. Again, the red bloke is right down here when it comes to eye muscle. He's in the bottom 5 to 10% in Australia, eye muscle, whereas this bloke is pretty good. So they're pretty much two different rams. Now, this bloke is a run-of-the-mill, above average ram that's going to do you the job. This red bloke, I'd probably say he's probably more suited to heavy export because it's going to take time for his progeny to put on condition. They're going to be heavy. They'll reach the weight quickly. But they'll then need to sort of put condition on. Oops, sorry. We have a thing called correlations or correlated traits, where if you select for one particular trait, it can impact and make changes in other traits, right? So they're called genetic correlations. They can be positive or negative. If the correlation is positive, then there's an improvement in both traits. If the correlation is negative, one trait improves, the other one deteriorates. Now, looking at our carcass type ASBVs, growth, fat, and muscle. These are the positives are in the blue, the negatives are in the red. For you Victorians that play that handball game, aerial ping pong, consider this like a free kick or a 50-metre penalty. So if you select for growth, you're automatically going to select for leanness. And we got to a stage back in 2011 where we were actually getting too lean. But there are outliers. There are rams that you can select that will not only give you good growth rate, but they'll give you positive fat. We have all these positives. The ones I really want to just show you is the positive correlations with reproduction. you select for better growth rate, you select for more genetic fat and better muscle, you get free kicks when it comes to reproduction or fertility. So do they work? The short answer is yes. There's a summary of what they call proof of profit research and on-farm trials that you can find at the Sheep Genetics website. And usually the actual outcomes generally exceed the predicted or expected outcomes. And I'm just going to show you an example of one. This is an on-farm trial that two brothers up at northern New South Wales at Glen Innes conducted. They wanted to investigate the difference in value of lambs that were sired by rams with a post-weaning weight ASBV in the top 10% at the time versus the industry average or the 50 percentile average. So this is back in 2010. So they tried to keep the other ASBV values as close as possible so they weren't impacting on the results. And they concentrated on what they called the high post-weaning weight rams and the average post-weaning weight. So they went and bought these rams. Interestingly, and this is 10, 11 years ago, what was in the top 10% back in 2010 is now our average for growth rate in Australia. That's how quickly these databases are progressing. The expected response between the two lots of lambs would be this rams or these rams values minus this value, right? So the difference between the two, and that's 6.5 kilos. But they only give half the genetics to the lamb, half of the genetics comes from the ewe. So the expected response is 3.25 kilos difference at post-weaning time or about 7 months of age. All right. They weighed the lambs at various times. This was at the selling point in the second week of March. The expected response again was 3.25 kilos. The actual response was 5.1. As I said before, most times the expected is surpassed. So they actually get better results than ones that we're actually expecting. So what all that mean? So the ones from rams that were in the top 10% for growth rate in Australia, their lambs were 5 kilos heavier, extra 2.5 kilos carcass weight. They sold these lambs in 2011, which at the time was a record price for $6.20 a kilo. We are now selling mutton for that sort of money. So that equated to an extra $15.50 per lamb from every sire that were in the top 10% for growth rate. They averaged 100 lambs per ram joined. So that means each ram returned an extra $1,550 in its first joining, first year. If we use the same analogy and you average 70 lambs per ram, you get $7.50 a kilo for them. That means you generate an extra $1,300 in the first year or over $5,000 more over that ram's 4 joinings or its lifetime when compared to the industry average for post-weaning weight. Okay, so it does pay to pay for good genetics, particularly given, look, we're sitting $8.50 to $9.50 a kilo for most sheep meat. The beauty of the whole thing is that it works in merinos too. This is some trial work out of Western Australia. By all accounts, the only sire, this is post-weaning weight or growth rate potential of the progeny, if you like, from the rams. The only sire that stood out physically was the one right at this end, up around 9.5, 10 for ASBV value. And that is a really strong relationship. So growth rate works in all breeds. This is some work that Nick Linden from Victorian Department conducted a few years ago with a feedlotting trial where they recorded actual intakes using EIDs, actual intakes and growth rates of shedded lambs. We had post-weaning weight down here and we had feed conversion ratio here. The work he found that feed conversion improved the higher the ASBV for growth rate. So you select for growth rate and you get a free kick in terms of feeding efficiency. Again, particularly for self-replacing systems and trying to breed a resilient breeding ewe, all these sort of things are going to help. This one is some on-farm trial work that Mark Murphy from up here near Gundawindi conducted back in 2008. It's a few years old now, but it's really strong message. So he's really into the multi-purpose type merino. What he wanted to investigate, we have this grey line is the eye muscle ASBV values. The orange line is our fat ASBV values. And he had a range of rams that were really high for both fat and eye muscle, or really low for both fat and eye muscle. And this is the result across those rams. These are the different sizes on the bottom here. There was a 20% drop off in weaning percent between sizes that had really good fat and eye muscle versus those that were below average for fat and eye muscle. So they put reserves into the lambs. What actually happened when he was doing this, he had a really bad barber's pole problem, and it just worked out that those lambs that had the better genetics for fat and eye muscle were able or more resilient in terms of surviving that stress. Two rams, A and H, both had the same WEC value, this worm egg count, around about 30%, which basically says that progeny will be about 15% more resilient than the average. Again, that value divided by 2. And again, he found, even though they had the same WEC value, those lambs from this sire up here that gave better reserves, fat and eye muscle reserves, survived. So they work. Okay, so what's a ram worth? I know it hurts at the moment. I don't know what the ceiling's going to be. It's very high and really high rates, if you like, or most sales are actually selling out. So there's such an interest in getting back into our sheep industry. It's fantastic. But size have a significant and extended impact on your system, particularly if you're self-replacing like a merino system. But really they cost you little in terms of their cost per lamb produced. If you pay $1,500 for a ram and you're doing well, if you can pick anyone up from any breed at the moment for that sort of money, and he gives you 70 lambs per joining over 4 joinings, that works out at $5.36 per lamb for all the lambs that he produces. A ewe, though, if she's valued at $250, which is probably under the mark, and she gives you 6 lambs over her lifetime, that works out at $41, $42 attributed to the cost of that ewe. So buying and paying for good genetics is cheap. So you've got to try and get best bang for your buck and buy the best ASBV values you can. Now, it is possible to estimate a ram's value. You can do it a couple of ways. One, you can use the individual stud that you're buying from, his average commercial ram price, or what you think or what he thinks or they think the rams are going to average for that sale. Well, what I normally do is use the average price, say, for a 50 percentile ram, or the average ram in that database in Australia. As I said, be prepared to pay for predicted performance, because it does pay. These are just some screenshots. We're going to look at a dual purpose or merino style operation. This is the ram calculator that Murray and I put together. I'll just walk you through both a dual purpose and a terminal sire situation. So we're saying, okay, you can change these values. Anything in the white cells you can enter. So we're saying we've got 2% rams at joining. We get an 85% weaning rate, so quite a low weaning rate. But you can change all this and see what impact it has on the value of the ram that you can pay up to. Total lamb side per ram is going to be 170. 85 of those, half of those are ewe lambs. There's 64. I'm basically putting in there that you're selecting 75% of your ewe lambs for replacement breeders. You can change that value if you want. You also have 85 weather lambs. So you have in total 106 lambs are going to go to slaughter, and you have 489 fleeces over the lifetime of these animals. So the ewe lambs are going to be shorn 5 times, and we're shearing the weather lambs once before sale. We then put in the ASBV values for post-weaning weight or yearling weight here, and this is clean fleece weight value here. These values here are the average for the merino database at the moment. So the 50 percentile value for post-weaning weight is 4.3. and 50% value for clean fleece weight is 18.9. You put in here your wool cut, and so we're saying here 5.5 kilos clean. This value here 100%. If you actually put in your greasy there, you then need to change this and put the yield percentage in there. It then predicts what gain you're going to get per sire. We then put in a price that we can sell the carcasses for. I'm saying $7.50 for a merino style operation, $12.50 clean. It then tells you over that ram's lifetime, he's going to return you $532 more in sheep meat and $1,000 more in fleece. So he's worth an extra $1,556 over the value of these average rams. Okay, and if we say they're valued at $1,000, if the average 50% old ram in Australia is $1,000, you could pay up to $2,500 for that particular ram before you're worse off, or before you're better off buying an average ram or 50% old ram. Right, so you can pay a fair few dollars for that. We look at the same process with terminals. So we've got 2% again. We've got here 135% weaning. This is our 50% value for post-weaning weight at the moment. This value here I've put in is in the top 20%. So if you were buying a ram that had 16.5 post-weaning weight, he's in the top 20% for rams in Australia. The total gain for that ram compared to the average ram over his lifetime is $1,200. And if the average, say, white Suffolk ram, 50% old values is $1,000, you could pay up to $2,200 more. Sorry, his maximum value, before you're better off just buying the average ram. If we change this to now 18.5, and there's rams out there that you can get, these are rams out in the top 5%, that bumps our total gain up by $600-700 or so, and the maximum ram's value compared to $1,000 for a 50% ram is $3,300. So you can use it, you can actually work it out. I'm going to finish with these couple of graphs just to show you the importance of sheep meat price and genetics, or the ASBV values. Just bear with me for this. So all these figures have been generated by the RAM calculator. We're looking here at merinos. We have 4 joinings or 4 years. We're saying an 85% wean. I know again that's low, but it doesn't really matter. It's all relative. We're selecting on yearling weight and yearling clean fleece weight. These grey bars are rams that are in the top 15% on the percentile tables for yearling weight and yearling clean fleece weight. The orange bars if they're in the top 25%, the blue bars if they're in the top 35%. We sell the progeny at $5.50, $6.50 or $7.50 a kilo. If we say, okay, the merino is going to average around $6.50 a kilo, the extra money you can actually spend on rams from the top 15% or in the top 15% for yearling weight and clean fleece weight, there's about $1,100 difference between selecting rams from the 15% and the 35% off. Right, that's how much more they're going to actually return you. That value, $2,810, is on top of, again, in this example, I've said the average ram is $1,000. So you could spend $3,800 if you think you're going to get $6.50 for those lambs. More than likely, you're going to be getting around $7.50 on the merino side in the long term. Dernies, similar sort of process, exactly the same thing. Terminals, in this case, we're looking at $8.50. I've just selected on post-weaning weight. So grey are rams from the top 15%, brown are the top 25%, blue are the top 35% for growth rate up to weaning. Again, this is at 85% lamb weaning. So again, if you only average 85% wean, well, your top rams, if you're selling the pricing at $8.50, you can pay an extra $1,830 above the average. If you wean 130%, that bumps up to $2,400 more than the average ram. Okay, so there's our profit driver. So we've looked at wool, we've looked at cheap meat prices, and we've looked at weaning percent. And to my mind, they're the three main drivers for most enterprises. Last one is shedders. Now, I actually did this over 6 joinings because they really do need to, and this is Dorpers, Australian whites and the like, they really do need to get greater use out of the rams to compete against even a merino operation. But again, a similar sort of result. I've used $7.50 here. I'm not sure why it should have been $8.50, but similar sort of thing. You can look at paying an extra $2.5 grand more than an average ram if he's worth $1,000. So don't be scared to spend dollars on good genetics because it does pay. Okay, just to summarise, ASBVs are a tool that can be used to improve our lamb number, lamb survival, growth rates, feed conversions, carcass and wool incomes, and breeding ewe efficiencies. The key, however, is balance. Identify what your primary profit drivers are, define your breeding goals based on those, and use ASBVs to meet both. So have a clear, measurable breeding objective. Select your replacement size on both structural and genetic merit. Place emphasis on those traits that are important to your flock or herd breeding and production, your targeted market and the environment. And again, don't be scared to pay for good genetics. Thank you. Any questions?
Hey Geoff, I've got a question.
Oh.
It's Laura, sorry. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, I can hear you, Laura.
Yeah. We were looking at rams last week, and one thing I was wondering is the ASBVs were looking at yielding growth rates, but also on the individual rams there was notes on eye muscle depth and fat, and some produced really good yielding growth rates, but didn't seem to have a lot of eye muscle depth or fat to themselves, and I kind of wondered what sort of balance you'd be looking for in some of those. I mean, bearing in mind that they're not all ASBs, which makes them hard to compare, but are you ever going to be leaning too far one way, I suppose?
That's a good point. Good point. Really good point, because you put too much emphasis on one particular trait like growth rate without trying to balance, where you can sort of cause some problems down the path. Were the fat and eye muscle, were they raw measurements or were they ASBV values?
No, these were raw measurements. The stud's not at the point where it had everything to show. So as I said, it's a bit hard to compare.
Yeah. Be really careful of those raw measurements, because it's taken at one point in time. There's really, and it doesn't take into account whether or not it's 70 kilos or 50 kilos or it was a single or a twin or anything like that, right? They're just raw measurements on how that animal was measured on the day. So it's all that background environmental sort of noise is still there. It used to be with Sheep Genetics Australia that they wouldn't allow studs to present any raw data. They tend to do that now. I guess I should say too, there are other testing systems out there. There's another one called StockScan. There's another one or two minor ones, but and they base a lot of their information, or it's not ASBVs. They base a lot of their data on raw data, and honestly, it's too hard to predict an animal that might be a thumping big single-born lamb, which looks like a very good eye muscle, say 35 millimeters depth or something, but a twin-born lamb next to him with a 32 millimeters may well be a better buy genetically. It's great that the studs are getting into it. It is difficult, particularly in Western areas, for studs to actually go out and collect a lot of the information. Accuracies are certainly improved. The more information and more linkages they can actually get into the system, though.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Geoff,
Right.
another question, Geoff Crockett here. We've been basically selecting for... Sorry, did you not finish, Laura?
No, you're right on.
We've basically been using fertility and reproductive criteria to select for rams, which is fine, and it's working. But we got the situation now where the ewes are just creeping up, and of course a bit more, feeding of grain. The ewes are creeping up over 80 kilograms. They're sort of running it every time. The only time we ever weigh sheep is when we sell the old ewes and that. But they're weighing sort of 83, 85 kilograms, and they're not getting any smaller. We're not actually selecting rams for size, but we're getting the complementary effect of all these fertility traits. And we're getting bigger sheep all the time.
It's a really good point. And it's a difficult one because, pushing growth rate pushes up that mature weight. We know all the problems with shearers and that sort of thing with getting extra heavy ewes, and plus efficiency of the ewes. I mean, if you're feeding an 80 kilo ewe versus a 60 kilo ewe and they're both giving you a single lamb, because about 2/3 of the annual feed intake goes to the ewe just to maintain her weight. So bigger ewes are going to eat more. I mean, they might be more efficient, like I showed with that slide of Nick Linden's work, but until we can actually get down and start to actually treat sheep or record sheep on an individual base and not just a flock base, we've just got to try and put a ceiling on growth rates or mature weight.
How?
A lot of times, probably the best thing to do is to look at the yearling weight value more so than the post-weaning weight if you're selecting rams on a merino operation, right? Because some sires will have progeny that just keep going, others will tail off or level off, and try and select a bit on size. But as I showed with that photo of the single and the triplet ram, you're not to know unless you know their birth type and rearing type. Are they smaller frame because they were a twin or not? You don't know. It's a difficult one. I don't know if we've got the answer to try and pick back the mature weight issue.
Yeah, certainly the shearers aren't complaining, but feeding an extra 20 kilograms a ewe for a start all the time is a pain in the ass.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Well, would you go to an open day at a stud, and if their mature age rams were 150 kilograms, I know what I think.
Well, if we can actually use, and I know you don't like it, Rick, but use what you've been doing with Tim and Tam and sort of breeding a more dual purpose type animal, you admit that you've fallen away on your fleece cut, but your fertility is really improved. Your growth rates are really improved. Survival. Yep. Your conception rates in new lambs. Phenomenal.
So I wouldn't, I've got to be careful what I say. I wouldn't be all that interested in the stud. My mature age rams are probably, not over 100 kilograms. There you go.
Yeah.
But like Crockett, we're hoping that our mature age ewes would come down, and they're not really coming down, but they're not going up either.
Right, so you're able to put a bit of a ceiling on it.
Well, I believe so. Yeah. But I was expecting them to come down a bit. Yeah. But
I think it's going to come back. I think it's mainly going to come back to selecting on frame score. Right. Yeah. So, just try to select or throw out those ewes, even if they are potentially going to be good producers, but those ewes that are going to be excessively big. So it's going to be a combination of a couple of things. Frame score, I think, is something we're going to have to look at. But the beauty, again, with something like you've been able to do, Rick, is your classing percentage now. I mean, you can throw out 30, 40, 50% of your ewe lambs.
Which we do.
Just keep because of your fertility rates, because of your marketing and win percentages.
Yeah, and it's survival rates. Survival rates is the important percentage, and so you can come through at classing time, and she can have, she can be a marvellous ewe to some people, but if she comes through at 25% heavier than the average, and she's just far too big, she's out. Yep.
Yeah, if we can, particularly like Victoria in particular, and we'll come across Australia, but electronic tags, and you relate back, if you can get the hands on the ewes at marking time and see whether or not she's reared 1 or 2 lambs, you know her scanning category, you're able to identify whether or not she's lost 1 or both lambs, for example. You start putting all that data in, well then, yeah, the figures actually will work out who to get rid of. So if she is a good ewe, but she's borderline in size and she's getting a little bit on the big side and she's not rearing ewe product, yep, she's got to go.
The other problem is, Geoff, if you're selling your maiden culls, the 66 kilogram cull ewes are the ones making $500.
Surplus to requirement.
Yeah, they're making $500 where your 50 kilogram one's making 300. So that's the thing about, you say you don't want them too big, but the people buying the crossbred. Yeah.
We don't know the background of those ones though, whether or not they were ultra fed or they were born a month or 2 earlier or anything like that. So, well, I don't know the background, but you're probably right there. But it'll taper off, Crockett. It'll taper off. People cannot continue to pay the sort of money record prices. All we have to see is a bit of a hiccup, and for the sheep meat market to come back to a more sustainable level.
Oh,
yeah. And then the heat will go out of the market a bit. It may be a couple of years still before that happens.
Yeah. That's the trouble. Everyone wants a great big, your cull ewes or surplus to requirement ewes are worth a lot of money, and everyone wants a massive big maiden ewe, which is easy to produce.
Yeah. I have concerns with joining ewe lambs. I've talked with Rick about this. I mean, breeds like the Shedders have to do it basically to get that extra generation in because they haven't got a wool income. But I think it's still early days for, I don't know too many people who are too successful with joining ewe lambs continually. Rick, you've been sort of able to do that, getting very good conception rates out of young stock without having too excessive size, but it's come at a cost where you've cut back on the wool cut, okay, but picking up more than picking up the money in the sheep meat side.
And ease of management.
Yeah.
Just wool, just like a little bit evil, really. I think if we go chasing wool, And there again, I think some studs who are big wool producers and good sheep and good wool producers are not really all that keen on some of the ASBV, the breeding values, and therefore, yes, they don't have the eye muscle and the fat, and they don't wish to produce those to publish those figures.
I do struggle, or I do have some sympathy for those sort of studs, to be honest, because it's a big job actually getting a lot of that data. And if they started today and started putting information in, they're not going to come up very well at all initially, unless there's a lot of background info with link size that have been used commonly throughout the industry. One sobering point is, though, one good point is as I said, 90% of all AI or semen sales in merinos come from studs that have ASBVs. So we are inherently improving the whole industry. The trouble, I guess, I have as a consultant is, or even if I was producing sheep, is if I went to a stud that didn't offer me ASBV values, they might have some of the best genetics for growth or wool cut or fibre donor in Australia, but I'm not to know. I'm not to know.
Yep.
Has Dave gone to sleep?
I'm still here. Geoff, in relation to turning whether lambs off quicker, getting them up, should we be concentrating more on yielding fat depth or eye muscle depth? What would you be targeting there?
Yeah, 100%. 100%, because they've got flow-on effects in terms of dressing percent, meat eating quality, survivability, all that sort of stuff. So, yeah, I'd certainly be looking at it. And you might look at the ASBV table and say, well, there's only 0.1 or 0.2 of a millimetre difference, say, in eye muscle between something that might be in the top 30 versus something in the top 40%. So is that going to make an impact? Collectively, it all will. Right. If you try and balance it out, have good, I'm thinking of terminal size here, I guess, good growth, positive fat, positive eye muscle, it's just going to be all flow-on effect for that weather lamb. It really is.
Yep. Thanks, Geoff.